Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're going to do something a little bit different today as I feel that this video is fairly important. You see, Warhammer Fantasy is and will always be my favourite setting out of all the Warhammer games. It was sadly put to rest a few years ago due to a variety of different reasons. Now, we're seeing the rebirth of it in a sense with Warhammer The Old World, an upcoming tabletop game by Games Workshop, once again set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, but likely to be a few hundred years in the past. Described to be for Age of Sigmar as the Horus Heresy is to Warhammer 40,000. Now, that's all well and good. A lot of us, including myself, are extremely excited as it will be nice to be able to get new models for our setting, and not only that, but play stuff officially in tournaments and stuff like that. But of course, it is important to note one thing. History can indeed repeat itself, so the reason for this video is not only for us to see why Warhammer Fantasy failed, but as a reminder for Games Workshop, hopefully they'll be listening, as to what needs to change for the future and make sure that Warhammer The Old World is a success. Believe me, I want this to be a massive success, as that way it will remain supported for years to come and we'll keep getting new stuff to play with, which, you know, it's a tabletop game, we want to play. For context, for those not aware of my channel, I myself am a long-standing tabletop player and have been in the hobby for over 20 years. I don't dislike Games Workshop for what they did with the end times, because at the end of the day, these types of things are from higher ups, and I've honestly made my peace with it, as obviously we've seen some stuff like Old World being announced, some awesome PC games which keep Warhammer Fantasy alive and so on, so the best thing we can do is look towards the future. Now with all that being said, let's jump right in. Let's start off with the cost of entry. Okay, so this one is still an issue today when it comes to Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, but it was possibly more so when it came to Warhammer Fantasy. This is because armies had to be built in a certain way, and you needed 25% core. Core was a restriction when it came to all your respective armies. A certain amount of units were core, and for a 2,000 point list, which was more or less the medium norm, this was the issue. 25% of that could get rather expensive. So let's use the example of the Warriors of Chaos. Now, we're going to use today's prices, as this is the more common stuff, and we're going to more or less have these prices when it comes to Warhammer The Old World, I imagine. So a Chaos Warrior box brings 16 miniatures. This is all the way up to full command, which works out quite well, and costs £32.50. That, if you go up to full command, would be 254 points by the most recent standing. Obviously this hasn't changed since the end times, so that is half of your core stuff, meaning that if you want to bring 2 blocks of Chaos Warriors, that is going to be £65. This is of course just for your core, and obviously you're not going to bring just 2 blocks of Chaos Warriors. You might want to change around for a chariot or some Warhounds and so on, so you might not bring 2 blocks of 16. The core of your army could cost sometimes around £100, depending on what you play, and even more so if you played a Horde faction like say Skaven, the Vampire Counts. The cheapest army was likely to be the Ogre Kingdoms because it had a low model count, but everything else was really expensive, and it's not so much of an issue for working people, but people who are maybe students or children would not really be able to get into the hobby so well. There was a high cost of entry, and it did kind of affect the hobby. For context, in my area, there wasn't a lot of players. There was a decent amount, but it was always the same people, and they wouldn't be able to build up their armies or try out new armies because yes, it was expensive. Now, we did have the start collecting kits in the form of battalion boxes, which were really good, but even then, some of those things just weren't really good for your faction. The battalion boxes, just like say the start collectings now, are always going to be a bit of a weird thing, but they are still very much welcome. Now with the cost of entry being so high, again, that meant less players, and since we're expecting this to be a Forge World game, it's going to be expensive again. Unless we get a large variety of miniatures from Age of Sigmar which will be backward compatible, which would be the best option, and I hope so, as obviously that means that, yeah, More people will be incentivized as they can pick it up from Games Workshop, means that they can pick it up from stores, rather than Forge World, which you have to exclusively buy from Forge World or directly from a Games Workshop store, I think, physically. I know that you can buy it directly in Warhammer World, but let's be honest, a lot of people like to support smaller, friendly local game stores, because those are the little man, and it's always nice to support your local store. Now, cost of entry aside, people would still build up their armies, and yeah, some of them would build up some really nice lists. But this leads us to our next section, which is rules and army updates. This is going to be quite a heavy conversation. Okay, so a lot of people might think that since Warhammer Fantasy is so old in terms of comparison with the other settings, that they didn't get FAQs, and in fact we did. 8th edition did have a few FAQs, which updated rules and, well, tried to balance things out. I'm using try very loosely here. You see, a big issue with Warhammer Fantasy is that rules did get updated, but not the rules that needed to get updated. This is a major issue when you look towards, say for example, the Tomb Kings, who had one of the worst army books throughout the whole of 8th edition. I'm going to be using 8th edition a lot as the reference point, as that was the last edition of the game. Put it this way, with the Tomb Kings you had a Hierophant, your army leader. Now if your Hierophant was killed, well, you pretty much just lost the game anyway. You could try and push as much as you can, but your army would start to crumble. This was a thematic rule that they had in previous editions, like with the vampire counts, which was updated for the vampire counts and was not needed anymore. Yet the Tomb Kings, the Tomb Kings just didn't get the update. Which was a massive shame, considering that the Tomb Kings had a massive model update and a lot of the stuff looked amazing. It's one of the armies that I visually am very impressed to see on the tabletop, but competitively, or even just for fun games, something can go wrong so quickly that, well, you just don't want to play them. I've actually seen this where, for example, on turn 2, or even turn 1 in some cases, where the Hierophant has accidentally blown himself up with a miscast for a spell casting, and yeah, there was no point continuing. You might as well just re-rack and start again. Not only that, but then we look towards other armies, say for example Bretonnia, which had not been updated since 6th edition. The Skaven were in a good place, admittedly, but the Beastmen were still a joke and had been a joke throughout most of Warhammer Fantasy. So Bretonnia, no updates, and they really showed. The comparison there was just that they were one of the worst armies on the tabletop too. The Beastmen, well, there was no reason to play them. In fact, the only time the Beastmen did get an update was during the End Times, which made them very much on par with all the other races and factions, and then the world blew up, so yeah. It was a massive issue, which seems to be a little bit better now with Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000. FAQs are coming out more frequently and issues are being resolved. Not all of them, but still better than it did get for Warhammer Fantasy. Believe me that some armies were just downright unplayable or completely broken. Worse so than, say, for example, the Space Marines when 9th edition came out. Yep, the Wood Elves were so much more terrifying than a Space Marine army. Now, I'm not going to complain about army composition, because obviously there's a meta, and it's not just Warhammer games. Every single tabletop game has similar army compositions in terms for the meta. So it's very likely that you'll see people bringing the same stuff with their armies. For example, the Chaos Warriors, it was very common to see chariots, chariots, and chariots, and most of it was stuff with the Mark of Tzeentch, because it was just the strongest. Though there was one thing that had a massive issue, and that was named characters. Unsurprisingly, Warhammer Fantasy, like Warhammer 40,000 or Warhammer Age of Sigmar, has a lot of established characters, and this brought a little bit of fluff to your armies, gave you some separate rules, maybe even let some other units become core options. It was really fun. The problem? Well, named characters were so horrendously overcosted, it was too expensive to ever bring one. Are you a fan of characters such as Manfred von Karstein, or Thorgrim Grudgebearer, Karl Franz, really any character that you might know of? Well, they were so overcosted there was no point bringing them. They had some interesting rules, some of them had some really cool abilities, but since they cost so much, even from a fluffy game perspective, well, yeah, there was literally no point to bring them. Again, for context, Archaon the Everchosen was 580 points. So Archaon is a very popular character for a lot of reasons, but since he costed so much, you wouldn't be able to bring him in a 2,000 point game, as early on you had a limit of 25% of your point limit to go to Lord and Hero options, meaning that Archaon was over the cost of a normal 2,000 point list. This was eventually changed to a 50% limit, but even then, that's a lot of points. Like, you could only bring one character realistically, and that was a massive shame because you wanted to bring other characters. You sometimes wanted to bring a banner bearer, which was very important, or a spellcaster, a blender lord, or a blender hero. You couldn't be able to do this with named characters because they were just so expensive. It was a massive shame that you'd be reading novels from Black Library or articles on White Dwarf on really cool characters, and unless you brought an army of no less than 2,500 points, or going up to 3,000 and above, you wouldn't really be able to legally, in terms of a list restriction, bring them to the table. And that was extremely frustrating. These characters mostly acted as paperweights more than anything, and that was a massive shame. 40k has gotten better with that, Age of Sigmar has gotten better than that, but this was a massive issue. Loads of really cool characters and no way to realistically use them. Again, I'm not talking about tournament play, as a lot of people aren't that competitive, but even in fluff games, you couldn't bring them, it was just annoying. Imagine reading the Archaon book, getting really into the character, wanting to field him, and then realizing that you need to buy more models to be able to realistically field him. One big issue that we had with models was the fact that, well, a lot of them didn't get updated. A lot of people have stated with prior knowledge that Warhammer Fantasy got discontinued because it wasn't selling, and you know what, fair enough, that does make a very good point from a business aspect. With the high cost of entry, a lot of people weren't getting in, but also when it came to returning players or the players that never left, well, none of the models were getting updated, at least not quick enough. A lot of the models are extremely old. For example, the Skaven minis or even some old skeletal warriors and so on. These models were so old that, well, people weren't buying them because there was no reason to buy them. Say, for example, if you wanted to play vampire counts, it was more than likely that someone was selling off their army, you could just buy that because those miniatures were just that old. Granted, yes, they're not as old as, say, for example, the Eldar miniatures for Warhammer 40,000, but there's a few that are creeping up to that age. And as you can imagine, yeah, you could just buy them secondhand when people start quitting and so on because, yeah, there was just no reason to buy new ones. New models means new purchases. This is very common, and we see that with Warhammer 40,000. When the Tau got updated with their broadsides, a lot of people bought the new broadsides. The fact that models weren't being updated meant that you had the army looking extremely dated, which kind of put people off. Competitively, I played Skaven, which had one of the oldest lines throughout the whole of the lifespan of Warhammer Fantasy. Interestingly enough, there was a updated box with the whole Island of Blood thing, and now you can't buy half of the new models. It's really strange. Like, updated weapons teams, really nice looking rat ogres. No, you can't buy them anymore. Even for Age of Sigmar, you can't buy them anymore. Those units do exist, but you have to use the older stuff. It's something that boggles the mind because if the models do exist, well, those should be the new norm. Now we're back to buying rat ogres, which I can't even remember when they even got released. It's been that long of a time. These were the biggest issues in Warhammer Fantasy. Rules were not getting updated to actually fit with the theme of the current edition. Models were just getting more and more expensive with the cost of entry being so high. There was literally no reason to buy centerpiece miniatures like characters because, well, you wouldn't be able to use them in games in most cases. And then finally, models themselves were not getting updated. Basic frontline units would be the same for multiple editions, which meant there was no reason for you to buy more miniatures, hence why it didn't sell as much. So hopefully when it comes to Warhammer The Old World, we'll see all this being a thing of the past, and brought more in line with that of Warhammer Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000. Now, I'm saying this as just those main things, not that it needs to be in the same style of play as Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, because there's one thing that Warhammer Fantasy did better than all of them in a absolutely massive degree, and we're going to talk about that here because I've been fairly negative throughout the whole video, and I think we do need to leave on a positive note. The biggest issue in Warhammer as a whole was the rule bloat. This is no matter the setting. Warhammer 40,000 has this, Age of Sigmar has this, where as a edition progresses further and further, you will not only need the core rulebook, your army book, but then you'll also need a lot of FAQ stuff, which, yes, FAQ should definitely be a thing in Warhammer The Old World, but also sometimes extra books, campaign books, expansion books, and so on. This becomes a massive bloat. I remember someone telling me that at one point during 8th edition, they needed 4 books to be on the table with them at all times, as that's how their army played, which, yeah, that's absolutely ridiculous. Whereas Warhammer Fantasy was completely different. All you really needed was the rulebook and your respective army book. Yes, the rulebook itself was over 500 pages, but don't get discouraged by that. That was, well, not that much was actually needed from that rulebook. Only a very small amount was actual rules, where the rest of stuff was really cool stuff like fluff, introducing you to the lore, and even some scenarios so you could play some really cool thematic battles from the history of Warhammer Fantasy. Expansions to Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition did exist. We had the Storm of Magic, Blood in the Badlands, Tamukan's book, but you did not need these books. These were just extra fun things that you could do on the side. It's not like, say, for example, Warhammer 40,000, where as the story progresses, or even Age of Sigmar with the Broken Realm series, that you need these for extra rules and changes and so on. When a change came, they'd drop an FAQ and we'd move on. The rest of the stuff was just pretty much for fun. Stuff on the sides, which you could have some nice thematic play. This is something that needs to stay the same as it was done so well. You didn't need to have like 5 or 6 different army books, or say for example with certain army books right now in Age of Sigmar, if we look towards like the Lumineth, which currently have their 2nd army book despite being one of the younger races in the franchise, and an expansion book, and I believe something else, and it's likely that they're going to get something else as a 3rd expansion book, because they've already started hinting at the return of Tyrion and his Lumineth Realm Lords, which means more books, more stuff that you'll need to have on the table, or try and remember. It's a massive hassle. Warhammer Fantasy did that so much better, and this needs to remain the same for that specific reason. We don't need like 5 or 6 different books unless we're bringing a allied list and so on, but even then it was rare. Hopefully this video has been educational for people, as obviously this is a topic which is disputed a lot online. A lot of people will go, oh yeah, it's the fantasy fans' fault. A lot of people will say it's Games Workshop's fault. Personally, and in the most neutral way possible, I think it's Games Workshop's problem, because obviously this is their IP and they didn't really care about it a lot. Their obvious seller was 40k. From a business point of view, that obviously took the most attention, and yeah, I completely understand why. It still does nowadays, where 40k still gets more attention than Age of Sigmar, but it's leveling out a bit more. Hopefully that means that when Old World comes out, even if it is a Forge World game, which it's still not confirmed, but a lot of people are believing that because, well, it just kind of makes sense as that's where the Horus Heresy is too. Hopefully it will get a decent amount of promotion and be there to succeed, because I want it to succeed. Yes, it's not Warhammer Fantasy, it is the Old World, it's a successor in a sense, hopefully in terms of playstyle. But we might as well look to the future and hopefully have an open mind for it, and hopefully Games Workshop have learned from past mistakes in an effort to make sure that the game is good and does become successful. Let's be very honest here, they're riding on the coattails of Total War Warhammer, and eventually that's going to run out. So they're going to lose out on a lot of possible hype. I mean, we're 5 years into the Warhammer series for Total War, and still no Old World, which you'd think they would bring it out to be able to, you know, cross-promote. But hey. Before we end the video, I'm not trying to be antagonistic towards Games Workshop. It's very important that people know this. It's more the fact that Warhammer Fantasy is my favorite setting, and I want to see it come back strong and well. And, you know, hopefully we get some cool stuff. But is there anything I've missed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion, as this could be kind of cool. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games, where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.